my pleasure to introduce Ben Wynes, who is a final year PhD student based here at the University of East Anglia, and is working with Kathy Carmichael on Yugoslav dissidence. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you. So my paper looked at Djilasism, and I termed it New Leftist Dissidence in 60s Yugoslavia. I think this is quite an important topic when looking at Yugoslav history, obviously due to what happened in Yugoslavia in the 90s. As many of you are probably aware, communism in Yugoslavia collapsed and the country broke up in a number of brutal fratricidal wars. Initially there was a focus on looking back to the 80s to explain why communism suddenly went wrong. More recently there's been a feature of looking back to the 70s and the 1974 constitution. What I hope this paper has shown is that the real problems with Yugoslav communism emerged as early as the 60s, only to be buried after the events of 1968. Despite this, certainly in Western literature, there's been little focus on this new left emerged in Yugoslavia. I believe there's probably two main reasons for this, and the first is that the Yugoslav version of communism was less repressive than its Eastern Bloc neighbours. In 1948, the Yugoslav communists broke away from the Soviet Union and were expelled from the Comintern. As a result, they couldn't condemn the Soviet Union and still carry on largely mimicking it in its economic and political policies. And for this reason, the Yugoslavs attempted to forge their own path to socialism. And this path became known as Titoism, after its leader, Josip Broz Tito, and was aimed at defining a more different, more democratic form of communism, supposedly superior to that of the Soviet Union and its satellites. And this meant foreign policy of non-alignment, forming workers' self-management groups of factories and enterprises, creating a less repressive state, and ultimately a less domineering bureaucratic party. And as part of these reforms, the Yugoslav Communist Party actually changed its name from the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, and this was meant to signal a transformation of the party from a dictator in society to a mere guide and benevolent supervisor. And due to these reforms, Yugoslavia often received fairly favourable press in the West, and this was largely for its independent stance from the Soviet Union and the rest of the Eastern Bloc. But this has tended to focus analysis away from the more unsavoury aspects of the Yugoslav regime and the dissidents that resulted from that. And yet, while we can't doubt that Yugoslav citizens acquired far greater freedom than any other East Europeans, the Yugoslav system essentially was still all political and economic power was still in the hands of one party. There was a dominant communist ideology, and there was this cult around this charismatic leader. So, while the regime recognised some pluralism within the party after its split with the Soviet Union, it was never willing to permit the kind of pluralism that would that might end up challenging the ruling group's monopoly on power. And that's what we see as the measure of freedom in Yugoslavia was never clearly defined, and it was this very point that would become the main issue between the regime and its critics. The second reason I don't think, while there's been much focus on this topic, is because there's the belief that obviously the Yugoslav regime had come to power by a popular revolution during the Second World War, as opposed to Soviet geopolitical concerns. And therefore there was a belief that it was more stable and less prone to dissent. Popular support for the revolution was understood to have made any form of dissidence impotent and allowed the party to carry out this innovative and less repressive form of communism. And the logic of this argument seems unassailable. Popular support should translate into political capital. Yet in Yugoslavia this wasn't quite the case. The ruling party was actually burdened by a number of factors that made it prone to dissent, certainly from the left, all of which arose from its empowerment for a popular revolution. The first was a pervasive fear of losing its support. The second constraint was the existence of an already mobilised public who were willing and able to express their preferences and also had heightened expectations for the future. And finally, the third was a presence within the party of a number of leaders who were in a strong position to claim an independent basis of political support. And one of these leaders was Milovan Djilas. And Djilas was a man who became a catalyst for dissent amongst the left in the country. Djilas was one of the youngest and most talented of the country's leaders. He was considered Tito's heir apparent, and he was also, more importantly, the leading figure and the main architect of these more liberalising communist reforms that followed the split from the Soviet Union. However, by 1954, he felt that many of his reforms were being halted, if not reversed, by his colleagues in the party. and he gradually grew more disillusioned with the way communism was developing. He became repulsed by the growing bureaucracy of the party and the privileges and wealth its members had accrued for themselves. In his eyes, the party was forming its own class, living a life a world away from the average worker. And to combat this trend, he urged that the party needed to immediately wither away, and that if this wasn't possible, a second socialist party needed to be formed. Unsurprisingly, these ideas became a national and international sensation, and it attracted more interest in the press than any other event since Yugoslavia's clash with Stalin. Ultimately, Djilas was trying to answer a question that many ordinary Yugoslavs were asking themselves: why was this utopian dream of communism turning into the living hell of Stalinism? And everywhere, people began to give a free rein to their long-repressed wish for political expression, and this was, in my opinion, the first expression and free exchange of views that had ever occurred in communist Yugoslavia. Now, obviously, these calls for a second socialist party went too far for the rest of the Yugoslav leadership, and Djilas was removed from his position in the party and was later jailed. Yugoslavia's leader, Josip Broz Tito, defended his actions, making 2 points. The first being that there were still enemies of socialism in the country, and secondly, that the broadest masses weren't educated enough in socialism so that the party could not wither away. But the silence of Djilas and his sympathisers reflected a critical stage in the party and a confusion about the future course of policy. It may be going too far to call it a full-blown crisis, but the whole event did demonstrate that the democratisation process that had begun with the split from Stalin had come to a definitive, shuddering halt. And Djilas's fight and subsequent disenchantment with Marxism never really constituted the basis for a movement to develop around him, but his critiques did find a great deal of popular support, and this took the form of a struggle against the controls of ideology, party, and bureaucracy. In this respect, Djilas was undoubtedly correct when he said, there are no Djilasites in any formal active sense, but there is lots of Djilasism though. And this so-called Djilasism reached its peak in the 60s. And something that I think emerged when I was looking at writing this paper was the core role of the economy in this. Obviously it's cliche among Marxists that political development tends to lag behind socio-economic transformation, and the changes in the latter sphere create these irresistible imperatives for changes in the former. But whether universally true or not, the axiom does appear to fit the Yugoslav case in the 60s, as these changes that bubbled up in the realm of economics found their way into the political sphere. Because the early 60s were a period marked by dramatic reduction in economic growth. And this was important given the party had relied so heavily on its economic performance in the first couple of decades following the war for its own legitimisation. And one of Djilas's failures, for instance, was that when he launched his protests against the regime, this was at a time when the living standards of everyday Yugoslavs were on the increase. By the 60s, however, there was a recession, unemployment, mass emigration, and also this growth of what the Yugoslav government termed as social differences, i.e. growing income disparities. For instance, while about 40% of those in employment were receiving monthly incomes of less than 600 dinars, which is around $45, party functionaries and those in the managerial positions in the factories were receiving about 6 times this amount. So to combat this, the party launches mass reforms in the economy, and these reforms devolve more power to the workers and reduce the power of the government itself. And the motivations for these reforms were purely economic, but the debate quickly took an ideological character. After all, this liberal version of Marxist-Leninism left the door open for criticism from the left when Titoism fell into many of the same patterns as the Soviet Union, in this case in the economy, namely this growing bureaucracy and the privileges of the party had gained for themselves. After all, the most real and serious opposition to the regime for much of its existence didn't come from nationalist groups, which we often might assume given the tragic end of Yugoslavia, but actually for much of its existence came from the left. So this leftist criticism reached its peak in the 60s, and there were a number of movements that were trying to push this goal, and this varied from those that just wanted to liberalise the communist regime further to those that were arguing that this wasn't possible and there was needing to be this second socialist party. And these voices of dissent amongst the left came from 2 directions, from wider society, but also from within the party itself. In fact, the party itself was basically divided in 2 between the liberal reformists and the conservatives. By liberal, in this paper in the Yugoslav context, I meant someone that favours a more open society, greater respect for human rights, loose party supervision of society, and of course pluralism within the party. The Conservatives, on the other hand, favoured a strong central government and party, a less open society, tight censorship, social control, and of course democratic centralism. And during the 60s, it appears that the Liberals in the party were in the ascendancy. Numerous prominent voices in the party called for greater pluralism. In fact, by 1966, the leader of the Conservative faction, Alexander Rankovic, was removed from the party, and Djilas himself was released from prison after only serving half of his prison sentence. And in addition to this reformist bloc within the party, a new leftist social movement became prevalent in Yugoslavian society as a whole. After all, the decade of the 1960s, largely thanks to these liberals in the party, considerably extended intellectual freedom, and this was in areas of literature, the visual arts and philosophy, all areas that seriously challenged the Titoist system. And these artistic endeavours and philosophical explorations were based on a rereading of early Marx and were influenced by international left-wing intellectual currents. And the examination of life in contemporary Yugoslavia and the nature of the communist system led to the development of a multifaceted critique of the unrealised promises of the Yugoslav revolution. And these critiques didn't challenge the Yugoslav regime directly, but instead they pointed to some of the shortcomings of the political system. And for the first time, really, since the split from Stalin in 1948, the Communist Party faced a real political challenge. These younger men in the academic fringe believed that political liberalisation could and should come about within a Marxist context, through constructive criticism within the party. All of them were agreed on the necessity of obtaining total freedom of opinion within the communists, but again, some, just like Djilas, went on to then develop the ideas of a two-party system within socialism. And these ideas were put forward in a number of literary and philosophical journals, which began to form the first free press in Yugoslavia. And however limited the number of readers, I mean these were very theoretical magazines, the ideas did reach a larger public, if for no other reason than the reaction of the authorities. And I won't go into all the numerous new leftist social movements, but I did include some of them in the paper, and these included the Praxis Philosophers, the Perspective magazine. And their aim was, like I say, to give this Marxian critique of Yugoslav society, drawing on influences from the Frankfurt School in particular, and calling for a return to the original humanist values of the Yugoslav revolution. And over the next few years, the Yugoslav police regularly reported what it termed as Djilasism amongst the youth and across the universities. And Tito himself felt compelled on numerous occasions to denounce this growing Djilasism. The fact that Tito felt compelled to do this emphasised that it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep liberalisation under control, particularly among an increasing number of young writers who were not ready to bow to official interference. And this tug of war between the Yugoslav regime and these young non-conformist intellectuals reached its peak in public debate in the late 60s. So this growing demand for greater pluralism both within the party and society as a whole culminated in the mass student protests of 1968. For some time before the explosion of June 1968, it had been evident that this traditional apathy of many younger Yugoslavs was likely to give way to this international, fashionable activism and protest. And the Belgrade students who started this revolt staged strikes and demonstrations against the growing inequalities of what they denounced as a consumer society. Among their slogans were bureaucrats, hands off the workers, down with the principles of socialism, down with the red bourgeoisie. And obviously we see this general target was bureaucracy, both within the party but also this increasing trend of societal bureaucratisation. And there were echoes of solidarity and other uprisings in other universities across the country, and they received support from their teachers and other intellectuals. But what's important is this support was not only expressed within the universities, but there was also support amongst the workers. There was numerous meetings in factories, enterprises and offices offering support to the students. And this student revolt presented the regime with its most significant challenge since its split with Stalin in 1968. Importantly, however, like the Praxis Philosophers and the other sort of leftist social movements, the Belgrade student process of 1968 did not call for an overthrow of socialism or even the regime. In fact, during the demonstrations, the students carried images of Tito, they shouted loyalist slogans and referred to the university as the Red University of Karl Marx. And therefore, although the student protests had a political message, none went so far as to promote the notion of a multi-party system. Therefore, we can say is the crisis was revolutionary in nature, but it was not a revolution as such. It had all the external properties of a revolution, you know, mass protests, clashes with the police force, enthusiasm, creativity. But crucially, it did not call for an overturn of the existing order. And unlike the events in Czechoslovakia, the protests were ended peacefully. Tito went out and spoke directly to the students and persuaded them to end the protest. In fact, many promised positions in the party for their cooperation. In addition, Tito banned the Praxis journal and all these other leftist reformist journals and forced all of the troublesome professors and intellectuals out of the universities. And as a result, these sort of new left intellectuals were sort of transformed into the scapegoat to a past redemption and were made responsible for all the actions of the students and workers who are said to be real socialist Yugoslavs. So what we can say here is the party had the organisation, the power and the ability to manoeuvre within and around these opposition trends, which were largely confused, disorganised and not consciously synchronised. However divided otherwise, the apparatus of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia were united on the fundamental issue of power itself, and those that the regime deemed mainly suspect to wanting to keep power all in the party were quickly purged. So, for instance, Tito moved quickly to purge the party of all the liberals I spoke about earlier, and these liberals were grouped together with the heretic Milovan Djilas. And the identification of liberalism with dissent was obvious from the title of a 2-volume work that was published after 1968 entitled Liberalizm or Djilas do Danas, Liberalism from Djilas to Today. Thus by the 70s, the liberals within the party were defeated and dispirited. The ruling elite, which had been, let's say, narcissistically self-confident and untouchable prior to 1968, was now overwhelmed by feelings of anxiety, resentment and fear. To conclude, I should say that this repression that followed 68 brought relative, if temporary, stability, but it was predicated on the suppression of democratic debate, forcing underground both the nationalists and the Democrats. Ultimately, this repression of alternative ideas of the left dashed any hope that the Yugoslav system was reformable from within. The repression of these more liberal democratic elements implied that any form of activism now has to take place outside the existing structures of the party. And a number of these activists and intellectuals in their disillusionment began to attach themselves to nationalist movements, betraying the humanist principles that were originally at the core of their activism. Nationalism then became a new approach to a kind of pseudo-democratisation. And this was a crucial moment as it removed this sort of democratic alternative to the communist regime, and this would obviously have disastrous results in the 90s. Therefore, I would just say that it would be wrong to conclude that the Yugoslav communists have been largely successful until the 80s when all of a sudden things went wrong. As early as 1968, the reform movement in Yugoslavia stood at a crossroads. The mass student demonstrations stopped these moves to reform, and the euphoria I'd spoken about earlier that had built up over the course of this decade evaporated overnight. After the events of 68, Tito repeated more than once that not only the reforms of the 60s that we saw in the economy, but also the reforms that he brought in after the split with Stalin, the reforms that led to Djilas's fall, were a mistake. Tito's instinctive reaction to the events of 1968 was to reassert traditional party discipline. And to conclude the last point I'd just like to quickly make is in 1954, when Djilas was removed from power, he said that all his differences with his colleagues in the party could disappear if the party were to wither away. Tito's attitude then, as I mentioned earlier, was that there couldn't be a withering away of the party because there were still enemies in society that were enemies to the regime and to socialism, and the broadest masses hadn't been educated in the socialist doctrine. Now, it had been possible in 1954, only 9 years after the war, to argue this. There were still nationalists who wanted to overturn the regime, and many of the ordinary people were not schooled in socialism. But by 1968, neither of these conditions still applied. In writing this paper, it comes to me that the logic of events suggests that Tito should have probably embraced the new left and relaxed his dictatorship. After all, his long-term right-hand man, Edward Cardell, once proclaimed that not even the most perfect bureaucratic apparatus is capable of building socialism. Yet this is precisely what Tito attempted to do at the end of the 60s. The Yugoslav communists' retreat into orthodox Leninism after 1968 was an abandonment of the relatively liberal form of communism that had set them apart from the rest of the Eastern Bloc. The Yugoslav communists then created a state which bottled up nationalist, socialist and intellectual tensions that would eventually explode in the late 80s. It was perhaps Tito and the Yugoslav communists' greatest failing that in 1968 they could only see the new left as the enemy and not part of the broader democratic debate about the nature of the growing bureaucracy in society.